Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call the meeting to order. This is the Monday, June 22nd, 2020 Planning Commission meeting and Commission for Citizen Involvement meeting. Iris, would you please call the roll?
Beckett. Commissioner Beckett, or is your mute on? Fisher?
Here.
Heap?
Here.
Miller? Commissioner Semler?
Oh, here. Yeah, there was some interference. Sorry.
Commissioner Stewart?
Present.
Commissioner Whitman?
Here.
And Commissioner Beckett, I see him, but
Here. I'm here.
Commissioner Pepe, has he joined us yet? Okay, so that's it.
Okay, thanks, Iris. First on the agenda tonight is citizen comment. This is regarding issues not on the agenda. This is an opportunity to raise issues regarding planning. A time limit of 3 minutes per individual applies. To speak during the meeting, you should have contacted Iris. If anybody, would anyone like to make citizen comment tonight?
This is Ormsby. Can I be heard?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
If you'd like to state your name and address for the record.
Name, Charles Ormsby. Nickname, Skip. Address, 170 Southwest Birds Hill Road, Portland, Oregon, 97219-8502, Lake Oswego Urban Growth Management Area, Clackamas County. Neighborhood, Birds Hill, CPO, NA. I'm looking at the documents. Primary thing is for the rest of the meeting, we in the neighborhoods, and I will be in communication with them one way or another. This process of HB 20.1 implementation is for schlocken. Bluntly, I'm looking at page 9 of 9, 9 of 9, it's packet 16 of 18. There's no really time for citizen involvement to be specified. And this is a technical process, which is inexcusable. There's more technical information known by the chairs and frankly, those in Loan Act then that is embedded in the Lake Oswego Planning Department and frankly, LCDC. This process of HB 20.1 is pounding stuff to fit, and we are not being involved from square one. And as I stated in previous correspondence, it's raping and vivisecting Oregon Land Use Goal 1 citizen involvement. This needs to stop tonight. And the Planning Commission, AKA Committee for Citizen Involvement, should do something about it now. Stop this process, delay it 2 years minimum, and start involving neighborhoods at all aspects. That's my gist of the communication. Also, get people to ride in a wheelchair and a TriMet bus, then you might understand. I went to the 2 regional meetings at LCDC at opposite ends of the region by transit. You don't have any idea what's going on to get a bus through the region, let alone somebody in a wheelchair. And that is primary problem that you've got. You don't have nomenclature for understanding stuff, from my perspective, in a wheelchair, in Lake Oswego, let alone regionally, let alone in the state. Thank you.
All right, thank you for your comment.
When are the chairs going to be involved in this process? That is my main concern tonight. When are we going to have seats, eyeballs to eyeballs? And I don't mean sometime between Thanksgiving and New Year's Eve.
we have received your message. We appreciate the input that you've given us tonight and the concerns that you're raising. So thank you. Iris, is there anybody else that would like to make a citizen comment tonight?
That's it.
Okay. Next on the agenda are the minutes for March 9th, 2020. Commissioners, are there any changes, additions that none?
Sure, you've got the March 9th meeting minutes.
Sorry, Director Siegel, your comment was? Director Siegel, did you have a comment?
I'm sorry, you couldn't have to repeat.
Did you have a comment, Director Siegel?
I was just saying that you have the March 9th meeting minutes before you.
So I asked if people aren't speaking, please make sure that you're on mute. I don't know if that's causing some of the audio issues that are occurring, but it can feedback in. So if you're not speaking, please make sure that you're on mute. Sounds like maybe the audio got a little bit better. Thank you. The question was, were there any changes that commissioners would like to make to the March 9th, 2020 meeting minutes?
No.
Is there a motion to approve the March 9th, 2020 meeting minutes?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes, March 9th.
I'll second.
There's a motion to approve the March 9th, 2020 meeting minutes. There's a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Abstaining? So the minutes are approved. Next on the agenda is the Commission for Citizen Involvement General Update. I didn't have any updates this evening, so we'll move on to the next agenda item, which are item number 6, update. This is item 6.1, the Housing Policy and Housing Needs, PP 19-0008. The Commission will receive an update on recently completed and ongoing policy initiatives and an overview of existing housing needs in Lake Oswego, in addition to identifying issues for further consideration. Senior Planner Olson, would you like to give us an update?
Chair Heap and Commissioners, before Senior Planner Olson gets started, I just wanted to preface these two items by saying that there's no action or decision point that is before the Commission tonight. The primary purpose of these two updates is to provide background to the Planning Commission on the city's existing comprehensive plan policies relating to housing, and also to give you an update on the rulemaking process that is still occurring at the state level on House Bill 2001. With that, I'll hand it over to Senior Planner Olson. Thank you.
Thank you. Planner Olson, you're on mute. If you'd like to unmute. Sorry, we cannot hear you.
All right, can folks hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Great. Sorry, I didn't realize I was on mute and I was in this screen share. Can everybody see the screen as well?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. All right, so as Scott alluded to, I'm here today to give you an update on housing policy initiatives that have been established by City Council. And, considering that it's been a little bit since we've discussed this at the Commission, we wanted to provide a bit of context about housing needs and relevant policies in the comprehensive plan to sort of give, again, some context to this discussion. So in terms of completed housing initiatives, back in 2018, the Planning Commission and City Council were able to complete initiatives related to accessory dwelling units, streamlining the process for the approval of ADUs. And they were also able to waive systems development charges, or SDCs, for ADUs and affordable multifamily housing developments. In terms of active initiatives today, so like I said, those were completed back in 2018. And I think I tried to point out in the staff report that work has sort of been ongoing since then. And today, the City Council has 2 active housing initiatives. One is to begin work to comply with House Bills 2001 and 2003. And the other is to begin work to construct at least 1 new affordable housing project by rezoning the Boones Ferry Road staging area to allow for an affordable housing development. So that's a quasi-judicial application. So, just as some background on that, back at the City Council meeting on May 19th, they moved to initiate comprehensive plan and zoning changes for multifamily affordable housing at both the Boones Ferry Road staging site, which is referenced in this initiative, as well as the former Marylhurst University campus, in coordination with the Sisters of the Holy Names, who are the property owners of that campus. So considering that both of these are quasi-judicial applications, we won't focus too much on them, again, due to what Scott had pointed out earlier about issues with ex parte contact. But we wanted to bring these to your attention, just given that they're relevant to housing policy. The Boones Ferry Road proposal would be a city-led proposal, and it would include opportunities for community engagement and outreach, in addition to following all required notification and neighborhood meeting procedures. And the application led by the Sisters of the Holy Names, that they would be the lead on that application. So that would be subject to the same notification and neighborhood meeting requirements as any typical quasi-judicial application. So, each of these initiatives would be subject to the goals and policies in the comprehensive plan, in addition to state level requirements. The land use planning chapter of the comp plan contains several relevant policies. And I've excerpted a lot of those in the staff report. But, this is really just to go over the types of criteria that applications for rezonings or comprehensive plan or code amendments would have to meet. So rezoning applications are required to address policies in the land use planning chapter related to residential density and the need for the rezoning. Any proposed changes to the comp plan or zoning map would need to address even more extensive criteria contained in that chapter specific to those types of applications, which again, generally rezonings involve that as well. But regardless, the complete neighborhoods and housing chapter also contains more policies specifically related to housing. So these are again excerpted in the staff report, but they contain a number of policies related to housing options and affordability. And there's policies in that chapter that are actually supportive of rezoning to high density residential zoning in existing neighborhood sort of business and commercial districts. And one of the action measures actually in that chapter includes a recommendation to work with Metro and the Clackamas County Housing Authority to develop targets for the development of affordable or workforce housing, also the preservation of affordable workforce housing is referenced there.
I just wanted to add one point, and that is that, as Eric was describing, the comprehensive plan does provide direction or guidance as to the areas that are appropriate for higher density zoning. And the neighborhood areas are really focused in what the comprehensive plan designates as village centers. So these are commercial, these are essentially neighborhood commercial centers. And the plan is also very intentional about not upzoning to high density residential zoning within neighborhoods themselves. So that's something that we're obviously going to have to reconcile with HB 2001, but that's the baseline, that's the existing policy. So thanks, Eric, go ahead.
Thanks, Scott. So just to talk a little bit more about the need for housing in Lake Oswego, I'm going to talk about some data from the housing needs analysis, which was actually conducted back in 2013, and talk a little bit about when we might expect to update that again, but it's kind of a state mandated process to an extent. but you know, essentially DLCD established a schedule for cities to update their housing needs assessments or analyses rather, in order to ensure that they're coordinated with new efforts by the state to do a statewide housing analysis. So looking at the you know, something more on that scale, statewide scale, and then having that coordinated with the housing needs analyses conducted by jurisdictions on a city level. So in order to sort of coordinate with that, they've established a deadline of 2023 for our updated housing needs analysis. So
Can I ask a question?
yes.
In the reports that we got, there was reference to a 1% and a 3%. How do those percentages relate to these numbers?
Well, those percentages are related to House Bill 2001 and the growth assumptions that might be used to project impacts in terms of you know, the impact of the proposed plan changes or zoning changes in total. So really just kind of in order to anticipate potential infrastructure issues, in order to anticipate population growth, et cetera, you know, that's the percentages that they've established for cities to use. A lot of that is specific to the infrastructure-based time extension process, but I think that's just kind of I think that might be even in the bill itself, that 3% assumption for essentially vacant land, and then 1% for redevelopment of parcels.
Not related to this 2,300 new units?
So the 2,300 new units was just in general about housing needs. So that does not accommodate the anticipated or you know, the changes that we don't know about yet in terms of how much this bill could impact the city.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Eric, one other question. In the material that we got, it said that there was a projected population increase for Lake Oswego of 8,000. Is that kind of what's being factored into this, that projected population growth of 8,000? And I think it was referenced to, I thought, a 2010 housing needs analysis.
So the housing needs analysis was conducted in 2013. I think some of that data was based on the 2010 census. So, you know, I think once the 2020 census comes out, it'll be a great time to sort of revisit that type of data, but we've done our best to sort of revisit it. So I know the last time that data had been adapted, I believe was in 2017. So there was a staff report, I believe in 2017, using the figures from the 2010 census and the housing needs analysis as a baseline, and then kind of modifying that based on ACS data, not the census proper.
So how exactly is the 37% multifamily dwelling need then established? And what data shows us that 37% needs to go to multifamily dwellings?
Yeah, so I think that's, you know, there's a lot that went behind it. You know, this was a large analysis, but the that data is based on, you know, the needs that were sort of determined at that time. Sorry, I'm trying to put this together. Some noises in the background. But anyway, it was dependent on the need to provide housing to residents of Lake Oswego at, you know, that 30% of their income or less. So that, you know, in order for folks not to have a sort of a burden on their, or to not be rent burdened, this is what we anticipate based on the demographics, based on the number of people that are coming into the community, what their preferences have been, et cetera. You know, what type of housing would be needed to accommodate that anticipated population growth. So it's based on projections of, again, that 8,000 number of, you know, we expect between about 2010, I believe, and 2035 for there to be 8,000 new residents. And I think that is, you know, that's related to that 2,300 new units that would be needed. So yeah, this is about the need within the city, really. It's not about looking at, you know, what the zoning changes could do to what will be produced. It's about looking at the demographics that are occurring and what the needs of those folk are.
It's worth mentioning too that the comprehensive plan is for the full urban services boundary that includes the city and the unincorporated areas, the surrounding neighborhoods that are in unincorporated Clackamas County that are planned to be annexed, or that the city has planned to provide services to those areas and ultimately annex them when the residents or the property owners request to be annexed. So, whether or not we'll hit that target or that forecast is really an open question. It has to do with how um, rapidly those areas annex and develop, which, as we know, has not occurred rapidly. Um, it also depends on how much infill and redevelopment occurs inside the city. So the 2,300 new units, again, as Erik was saying, is based on the basis for that, I think, was the 2012 and then the 2013 housing needs analysis and the demographics that from which the different housing types, the percentage of different housing types was derived. Those demographics are based on economic modeling, that's done for the region and from which our own local population and employment forecasts were developed. Again, back to 2012 and then 2013. We are required to update our housing needs analysis, and that'll be due in 2023. So there'll be a time that we need to look at this again in the near future.
Erik, one other question. Do we think that maybe these numbers are going to change so somewhat significantly? As Director Siegel was pointing out, the housing need analysis was from around 2012, 2013. It seems like the housing supply in Lake Oswego may have changed since then, and thinking specifically of the Riser Block, the change that happened there, developments that are occurring down near Cruz Way. Do we think these numbers may change since there's been recent update? And will they change significantly, or that's something that we'll see through the, you're saying the 2020 census?
Yeah, I think when we see the 2020 census and then when we move into updating the housing needs analysis, we'll see how we did. I'll tell you, when the city updated its comprehensive plan 2013, adopted in 2014, what we found is that the population projections that were used for the 1994 plan actually were pretty spot on, actually. And the rate of growth or the number of new housing units that we've been adding since 2013 is tracking along with the comp plan projections. The city has permitted or has seen applications essentially in the pipeline for a little over 900 multifamily housing units, including the senior housing at Mary's Woods, the Springs Living, Mercantile, the Windward, a number of smaller infill and redevelopment projects. And, those all add up. And from, all indications are that we're tracking along with the 2013 forecast, but we'll see.
Yeah.
I was going to say that I had seen some of the work done by Sarah Sullivan back in 2017, and she had adapted it based on more recent figures, and it was pretty similar to what was in the HNA in 2013. Does that address your question, Chair Heap?
Yes, thanks.
So just to move on, I think I identified that there is a, roughly 37% of the need for housing through 2035 would be for multifamily dwellings. And the housing needs analysis makes certain assumptions about where that multifamily housing could be accommodated. And because, and this is noted in the housing needs analysis as well, but folks might just generally be aware of the lack of large parcels in areas zoned for multifamily residential development. So due to that lack of vacant parcels in those areas, there is a pretty large assumption that properties will redevelop in the areas that can accommodate multi-housing. So instead of new projects on vacant land, it's assuming the demolition and rebuilding of some of those properties. So just another sort of element here pointing out how the multifamily development was anticipated to be accommodated at that time. So another thing I want to point out is that roughly 45% of new rental housing would need to be available to individuals earning 80% or less of area median income, or AMI, in order to really meet the identified need for renters. So that this is when it comes to renter occupied housing. Basically all these income brackets combined to about 45% of that total need for renters. So again, just another piece of data to point out from that needs analysis. So as I'm sure you're aware at this point, based on the staff report, but in May of this year, the City Council also authorized the mayor to sign a letter at that same May 19th meeting supporting the city's grant application to DLCD for work on HB 2001. So the work is really intended to provide a factual base of information on neighborhood development patterns, and HB 2001 requirements for community planning process. That will follow, sort of in 2021 through 2022. So really, the idea is to establish as much information as possible with which to have those conversations and talk about more about the recommendations. So I just want to also point out, that we are hoping to finish this work by June 30th, 2022, because that is the date where, if the city has not adopted code that is compliant with HB 2001, the state's model code would then apply directly to Lake Oswego. So doing this work, really to try as much as possible to, anticipate what we could see from the state and DLCD's rulemaking committees, and really just try to develop something that works for Lake Oswego and not have to adopt the state's sort of one-size-fits-all model code. So the proposed work plan here, well, actually, I just wanted to mention a few other things that, I think essentially that the initial rounds of work here are really intended to, again, inform the community planning process and sort of flag areas for the community to discuss further. So again, we're not really trying to, there's no intent to develop recommendations prior to sort of going out and talking to folks. It's more just, trying to get as much research as we possibly can once we are able to have some sense of where the bills are going.
Yeah, I would liken it to, you're going to buy a new suit, but you've got to go to you're going to go to the tailor first and get measurements. We need a lot of measurements. We've got 25 different neighborhoods, and we've got different architectural character and overlay zones. And we'd like to have a good systematic way of organizing that information. So when the planning process actually begins and we're having conversations around, what are the minimum requirements under the state law? Where do we have flexibility? We have a logical way to move forward. And I know that in some previous planning initiatives, like the sensitive lands effort that went on for decades, they didn't start with a base of information like that. And there was disagreement from the beginning about what the minimum requirements were. We're not going to repeat that. We're going to start with a factual base and then bring it forward to have a policy discussion about it. And that's where we really need your guidance and direction, is on the community process that will follow from that. Didn't mean to.
One question, continuing on the comments about measurements and data. If you go back to the previous slide that you were showing, and you look at the affordability and the low range, high range, I believe those figures are actually based on family size. And that these numbers seem to only give one dimension. Is there like an average? You look at the average of families of like size 3, 4, and 5, or how do you come to kind of these numbers, and how do you factor in different family sizes that move these numbers? Maybe not so much significantly, but they do move somewhat, as we saw in the Metro bill that was recently passed for affordable housing. So the question really is, how do you factor in different family sizes or moving?
I think that this range is intended to account for that. So the low range for These housing types would be for smaller families, and the higher range would be for larger families, or the low range might just be for individual families necessarily, smaller households. But I think Scott might know more about the work that was done at that point. So I'm not sure, Scott, if you have some other comments. I will just quickly say though that we attempted to look at last year. We did some work just kind of looking at a 1-bedroom unit and kind of using that as a base of analysis. And maybe we could share some of that with just kind of looking at what it would mean for a 1-bedroom, a prospective 1-bedroom tenant.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add is that this is really for illustrative purposes, and the land needs analysis for comprehensive land use planning is not intended to dial down into different options or different programs that might be available through low-income housing tax credits to now we have the Metro Housing Bond. So this is really about identifying land needs and making sure that the city has sufficient land zoned at the appropriate densities and allowing the housing types that the housing needs analysis says that we should be planning for. So I think, again, it's illustrative. And I think the ranges are, I think what Erik was saying is correct, that the low to high range would indicate different unit sizes and also some measure of uncertainty around and it's really just a snapshot in time as well. So, yeah. So again, when you start looking at a rezoning application, which Planning Commission will be looking at in the near future, that's where the applicant is really having to the burden of proof is that the applicant has to show that there's a need for the specific type of housing that they're proposing to rezone. And so we look at the comp plan, and we also look at current demographics and current market data.
Would the Lake Oswego have a unique profile, or would it again be kind of a standard type of a profile that fits maybe overall Clackamas County? I think in our previous meetings we've mentioned that in general we try to use an overall Clackamas County profile. But I'm just wondering, would Lake Oswego have a unique profile where it may have smaller or medium or larger size families, or maybe a disproportionate share in Lake Oswego according to county size?
Yeah, I'll defer to Erik on that. I think the way that the state and Metro approach that question of how the housing needs are allocated, or what is the proportionate share for Lake Oswego versus Portland versus Beaverton, that's all changing. And under House Bill 2003, the state will be developing a methodology that will be required to use. So I don't want to take away from Erik's presentation, but it is changing.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that generally, when we talk about Lake Oswego and things that might be different here, I think it's a new housing stock. I think that it tends to be a more expensive housing stock, partially for that reason, partially because of demographics in the area. But those housing types tend to have, more bedrooms rather for that unit. So I think a lot of the need that we're looking at here is stuff that the market really hasn't been producing as much, at least in this affordability range on its own.
I have a quick question
That's
here.
not unusual. That's consistent across the region and probably across the state, that local communities they're not meeting the need. That's why we have a housing affordability crisis. And the bond is one mechanism we have to deal with that. But it's aspirational, and it's a planning tool is really what it is.
I want to say that I really approve of the approach that Director Siegel is taking of gathering statistics on each of the neighborhoods. I have the theory that one of the reasons that housing in Lake Oswego has escalated so much in value is because of the superiority of our school system, and that's attracted families that are very well positioned in terms of the work that the homeowners do and what they can afford to pay for housing.
I also had a question. I just wanted to know if concurrently these statistics are being backed by, economic growth and things like that, and the anticipated population growth within the city. Are they going to be residents who work within the city? Are they going to be residents who commute outside of the city? And what type of considerations are being made there? Or is this sort of just, the state is growing, we need to make these types of changes without any anticipation of, concrete economic development?
I think I defer to Scott on how much these figures take that into account specifically. But I do know that there was a state of emergency related to housing that was obviously there's a housing bond passed by Metro in the time since these housing needs were developed. So I think at least on a regional scale, I think these things operate regionally to a large extent, but on a regional scale, there was an identified need for affordable housing on a fairly large scale. So be interesting. I think some of this work we will, when we, especially, when we take a look at the housing needs analysis again, that'll be, a very appropriate time to dig more into the numbers. But, I think for the purposes of the HNA itself, I'm not sure that it's required to get into that level of analysis. But again, I kind of defer to Scott on that.
Yeah, I think certainly at a local level, in the comprehensive planning context, the community can determine that through policy, if the intent is to be able to accommodate more of the workforce, so that we're not having people commute across the region for jobs in the schools or EMTs or service sector jobs, and because transit is not, we don't have very good or rapid bus transit service yet. That's a policy approach that the city could take when it's updating its plan. That really, what we're trying to do is balance the need for workforce housing with our ability to provide new housing, because we are constrained in the amount of land that we have, and the real estate values are working against that. So it's a balance, I think. And that's I think in terms of the analysis that the city used in updating its plan the last time around, the methodology is very similar to the methodology that other local jurisdictions would have used in the Portland metro area. In fact, there's a sort of a cadre of local, or not local, but regional economists and consultants that do this type of work, and it's helpful because they kind of have the perspective of the the regional labor market and the regional housing market, and then they apply the state planning rules and the methodology. It tells us based on population and job forecasts what type of housing we should be planning for. It is a local planning document at the end of the day. So, when the city is updating this again, I'm sure we'll be having those conversations about workforce housing.
Sure. I guess part of my question is just based on, if you're bringing, 8,000 people in, or 8,000 people are moving to Lake Oswego by, the projected date, 2035, obviously businesses around the city are going to need to increase just to accommodate, the new residents. But can the city also work in tandem with that and say, okay, based on this, we're going to have 8,000 new people, whether they're working or not, and if they are working, can we attract new business, and are they working in tandem in that way? And I don't have a channel to anyone who may be making that decision or doing that. So I'm just asking the question.
Yeah, it's a great question, Commissioner Semler, because the city has not, the last economic development strategy or plan that the city undertook was around 2010, I think. And it was focused on business retention and expansion, I think, were the two areas of focus. And, a more comprehensive economic development strategy would be looking at housing, transportation, other labor costs, and how to, how the community can remain competitive but also retaining the businesses that make Lake Oswego what it is, the quality.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to be having those discussions. The council has said as another one of their goals that we would develop an economic strategy working in partnership with the chamber and the community. So I think there'll be an occasion to look at this question again through an economic development lens.
Sure. And then I guess my last question in this vein is, has the planning department or the city looked into potential tax revenue growth based on the growth? And are there figures for that? I mean, I know we'd asked that question about, the 1 to 3% growth annually based on Housing Bill 2001. If the city's looked into potential revenue gain off of the increased population, I'm just wondering if there are any numbers associated with that.
We have not modeled sort of I think what you're getting at is the fiscal impact of House Bill 2001 and the increase, just the volume of development that we might get. I think the first step is really to kind of better understand the requirements and also where the housing would be compatible, where it would work within the community, and then whether it's really generating enough construction valuation that it's adding to the tax base. We'll see. I think it's going to be a fairly small sort of impact or number of units that we'll see, at least initially. Just by comparison, we have about on average probably 100 to 100 and a little over $100 million in construction a year, and that's everything from just residential remodels up to $100 million projects. And so I don't know how many duplexes, triplexes, and quads we're going to see over the next 5 or 10 years, and if they'll really have a significant impact or not.
Yeah, and I guess just another thing I want to point out, I think Scott, I want to just echo what he was saying in terms of the anticipated increase in development due to this. The 1% is actually over a 20-year time frame, and so is the 3%. So it's not annual. It would just be extended over a fairly long time frame. And again, that's kind of, it would only apply to parcels. It wouldn't be like a citywide 1% or 3% increase either. So I think they're looking at sort of parcel by parcel area, just giving guidance for cities to prepare their requests for an infrastructure-based time extension. So it is a little bit different than what we're talking about in terms of the what type of analysis we might want to do for what this would look like in Lake Oswego. We're not really confined to what that process dictates for us in certain ways, but I think that they developed that 1% and 3% assumption based on a lot of good work. So it might end up that is, that those are still the appropriate figures, but it's not a mandated process to the extent that the structure-based time extension request process is.
Gotcha. And sorry if my questions are derailing your presentation there.
Oh, not at all. No, they're really important questions. I mean, this is there's a lot going on here, so it's I certainly understand where you're coming from, and I think just talking about the sort of location of jobs in relation to transit, or I'm sorry, in relation to housing, there has been an effort at least there's been a stated sort of intent for some of the proposals that we're talking about for workforce housing. I think that's a lot of the conversations that are around workforce housing and providing, especially at the Merrillhurst campus, potentially areas for folks that are working there that might want to live nearby to where they're working. So I think that's, part and parcel with kind of what we've heard from City Council for a few years now.
Okay. Thank you.
So, I'm pretty close to done with my presentation on this component here, but I will just point out, we have sort of two phases of the work plan. As we mentioned before, the initial portion would be the grant funded portion. And we're proposing that would be a lot of research and analysis and just kind of in-depth review of the comp plans and community development code to determine what would need to be amended or what would not be in compliance with HB 2001, depending on what that turns out to be. And again, we're doing our best to anticipate, when the state will actually develop these minimum requirements and design a process where we can be responsive at the time when we do expect to know. So that's really what we're hoping to do for that chunk of time. And the second chunk of time would be, we've said April 2021 through March 2022, but it could go as long as, June 2022, depending on how the process works. But that would be the ultimate deadline, obviously, for whether or not we could avoid, the state's model code being applied to us. So anyway, that process would involve extensive community engagement and a lot of work to sort of take that research and try to develop recommendations that are suited to the unique characteristics of various different neighborhood patterns in the city, and that's why we want to do a lot of that upfront work to sort of know specifically, quantitatively and qualitatively, what sort of defines those neighborhoods.
So, Eric, just to summarize then, would it be fair to summarize it as, we're going to spend an entire year just basically working on collecting data and conducting research to get information, and then we're going to spend another year after that to really get community engagement and then make recommendations. So it seems like there's a significant period of time where there'll be the opportunity to get community input. Would that be a fair summary?
I'm sorry, what was that last part, Chair Heap?
It would be an entire year to collect community engagement, get community input, and then make recommendations. So it seems like the first part is really just to collect data, and that's the first year. And the second year, from April 2021 to March 2022, it's almost an entire year to work on our community engagement, get lots of input, and then make recommendations.
That was our thought.
Yeah.
That was what we were thinking.
And just to point out, not to get too fine-grained on this, but on phase one, there's probably about 3 months of RFP and contracting involved there. So we're not actually doing research in July and August, most likely, but we're getting a consultant under contract and then they're getting underway. So it's probably more like 6 or 7 months for phase one work. And then phase two is really a full year of effort with the community.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we've covered everything I was hoping to cover today. But I just, we want to make sure that we, obviously there's more to talk about with HB 2001, and I'm going to touch on that in the next agenda item. So that is another sort of important piece here, is what the minimum regulations turn out to be from LCDC. So, before we get into that, just kind of acknowledging that there will be more discussion on that topic likely. Are there any questions that any of the commissioners here have about current city housing policy or initiatives or the housing needs analysis? Sorry, that was a question. Are there any questions from the commission regarding that particular topic?
I have none. Commissioners, are there any other questions? If we move on. I don't hear any other questions.
That should conclude my presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
So next, should we move on to next? House Bill 2001, 2003. Eric, did you cover that?
Should I just go right into it, Chair Heap, or did you want to anything else?
No, I was doing the agenda check. So we move on to 6.2. Are you saying you covered that?
Sorry, I couldn't quite make that out. I do have an update to provide. I can just get into it. I do have some content for you. And then obviously I'd like to hear questions.
Sure, go ahead. Sure.
Okay. So, just kind of to briefly summarize, and there have been a few updates, a few monthly updates on the rulemaking for HB 2001 and 2003 since I was last at the commission. So, there's been a lot of activity, still not a lot of consensus amongst the committees, but a lot of important discussions are finally happening. In general, I think it's worth pointing out that equity has been a pretty large subject in a lot of these conversations, a lot of these committee meetings. I think recent events kind of reignited that to a degree, and all of that. And I think, the committees have kind of stressed the importance of, the bill resulting in equitable outcomes sort of in a lot of these meetings. It looks like that will probably be primarily through the minimum requirements and the housing production strategies components. The infrastructure-based time extension request will incorporate equity metrics to an extent, but it will not be, quite as extensive as what they're looking for with the other components there. Essentially, just because of the limitations of the IPTR process, really. They know that it's a pretty aggressive timeline, so they don't expect jurisdictions to be able to do too much work and analysis prior to applying. In terms of the really big questions about, the extent to which this will apply, really, that conversation about how to define the areas, the sort of areas where the higher middle housing types, or basically all the middle housing types that aren't duplexes, so triplexes, quadplexes, townhomes, and cottage clusters, talking about the language in HB 2001 that states that those housing types shall be allowed in areas where single-family housing or single-family dwellings are currently permitted. So that's been an interest of the commission as well. So I wanted to focus a little bit on that. It's something that the committees, the Model Code Committee, the Technical Advisory Committee rather, had been discussing for a while, but it was finally brought to the larger group. And DLC really framed the discussion with two different approaches that could be taken to sort of conceptualize how middle housing could be applied to cities, and sort of how to define these areas where middle housing would be permitted. The first one they referred to as the whittle away approach, and that's kind of changing. I think they're going to a different term most likely with that. But regardless, I think the concept is something that the Rulemaking Advisory Committee seemed to be on board with. The details not quite as clear, but the whittle away approach would essentially begin with the assumption that these higher middle housing types, basically everything but duplexes, would be allowed in all existing areas zoned for single-family residential dwellings, and then sort of apply exemptions locally. So it'd start with an assumption that it sort of would be allowed everywhere, and then sort of cut things out or whittle away areas based on the presence of goal-protected resources or infrastructure constraints. And I think just a quick example would be, so we might have a baseline assumption that middle housing most areas throughout the city. For instance, if a development was proposed on a site with steep slopes or a site containing sensitive lands on the city's sensitive lands map, that could be the type of reason that the housing could be excluded from that area. So that's kind of the concept, but it's a little bit more expansive than that, I would say. Though DLCD does point to the designated hazard and natural resource areas that are protected under statewide planning goals, that could be sort of whittled away, and I think there's a pretty solid foundation to justify that. The committees acknowledge that a more flexible approach would be needed that allows cities to exclude middle housing areas due to infrastructure concerns or other locational specific constraints. The committee sort of referenced this idea of infrastructure constraints as being a little bit different than the infrastructure deficiencies that are pretty strictly defined through the infrastructure-based time extension or IPTR process. So this would be a little bit more broad and would think about it a little bit more long-term. So infrastructure constraint would be something that could not be identified by the IPTR process because that would have to identify a deficiency within that pretty short 2-year time frame by 2023. So essentially what the idea of allowing jurisdictions to exclude middle housing from infrastructure constrained areas would be to address all the different types of infrastructure constraints that weren't able to be addressed through INTER. So that is yet to be specifically defined. I think it's unclear as to where they will land on it, but they did give some ideas. I think they mentioned a variety of different infrastructure that they thought would be a good basis for communities or jurisdictions to argue, to not allow middle housing. And I think, the one thing they did mention was, transportation levels of service might be something that they would say, maybe that's not a good idea. Maybe we shouldn't, maybe we should draw a line there. So they still haven't drawn that line. They're still trying to think of what types of transportation constraints or what types of infrastructure constraints more broadly would be justifiable. But ultimately, it seems like they're kind of leaving it on the cities to justify it themselves and say, we think that there's a valid basis to sort of whittle away these areas as long as they provide a robust justification for doing so. So that is kind of where that conversation's at. In terms of additional sort of, they've talked about exclusions for goal protected areas, so sensitive lands, hazards, natural resources. They've talked about whittling away our areas with infrastructure constraints, and then they acknowledge again that there's situations that they might not be able to predict that also could, sort of lead to these circumstances. So they used one example from Portland, the residential infill project in Portland, and they sort of said, in determining areas that are not appropriate for middle housing development, one area that the city prohibited middle housing development included areas in the airport noise impact overlay zone. So the city had a prior agreement with the port, essentially to restrict density, residential density in areas near the airport. That's something that wasn't really covered by this like goal protected framework or the infrastructure constraints, but it is an example of something that, DLCD didn't predict that Portland sort of encountered. So they're trying to provide for more flexibility. I should also mention that they did discuss another approach. So we had this whittle away approach to where the areas where residential or middle housing would be allowed. And then they also discussed this balloon approach. And that would sort of just determine areas that would be suitable for middle housing based on their proximity to things like transit centers or town centers, commercial districts. So, for under this approach, maybe the cities could say we only want to allow middle housing in our town centers. So it would have an initial sort of geography that would be more limited than the whittle away approach. But I think it would be a very different framework. And so anyway, the committee sort of discussed that approach a little bit, and there seemed to be a large preference for the whittle away approach. I do think that there will be a lot more discussion on this, but I think that in this fundamental sense, there is an opportunity right now to weigh in on that concept of whittle away versus balloon. So if the commission has any strong ideas or feelings on that, I think it's quite a bit, of course, but this is the time where they're having a more consensus. And it would be it's a time where it might be to provide some comments. So if there are any opinions on that, the next meeting of the rulemaking advisory committee is on July 14th. And so I think it'd be advisable to try to get comments about a week in advance of that meeting if you could want to provide them. In terms of another sort of really important component here, which is the dimensional standards that are being proposed for middle housing, I think this might actually have more of an impact, maybe even than the sort of in areas conversation, in terms of the extent to which this will apply to Lake Oswego. So the requirements in the code really still permit, there's minimum lot size to essentially regulate density. So this is kind of based on an assumption that the bill sort of allowed duplexes to be provided on every existing lot. So one duplex per lot is kind of the concept. And, essentially the way that DLC has clarified that the minimum requirements would function would be that, triplexes, and I think I've described this before, but they're continuing with this, that triplexes would be allowed on lots, 1.5 times the minimum lot size. Quadplexes would be on lots 2 times the minimum lot size, so that one duplex per lot concept would just kind of be proportionally expanded to accommodate different housing types depending on the lot size. So what that means is that, if that's the case, then perhaps this middle housing would only actually impact, lots with a certain size. So that's another really big question, and there's no consensus amongst the rulemaking committee as to what those sort of minimum lot sizes should ultimately be. They continue to recommend this one duplex per lot thing, but there is disagreement. So it's still unclear as to where that will land, but that's another really important issue that I wanted to mention as well. So that's my long-winded update on that, but I'd be happy to take some questions.
So Eric, how long do the committees have to resolve these questions? When do they have to make the recommendations? You're muted.
They're required to adopt them prior to the end of the year. That's the biggest sort of hard deadline, but the most recent sort of news that I got on this just taken from DLCD staff and what they mentioned at meetings, so don't take this as, take this with a grain of salt rather, but they did expect that they would have the full sort of set of draft administrative rules by either their meeting in August or September. So that's, from DLCD staff. So, this wouldn't go to the Land Conservation and Development Commission until November. So there's still some time to provide comment, but as I've said, the conversations are heating up and really getting at the heart of the matter right now.
Commissioners, questions for Eric? Yeah, Commissioner Stewart.
I think Commissioner Beckett raised his hand first, so I'll go after him.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Beckett.
Now can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Commissioner Beckett. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Yeah, I had a question. Part of the rules from 2001 limit the number of automobiles for a multifamily unit to essentially one automobile off-street per unit. So many families need more than one automobile these days. That would force cars onto the street. A lot of streets in Lake Oswego really are too narrow to have much on-street parking. Is that being considered?
Absolutely, yeah. There's a robust conversation around minimum parking requirements that's been happening. I think that this didn't really change since the last update, so this is something I didn't include in this month's update, but the recommendation continues to be basically the minimum parking requirement, not the maximum, but just the minimum parking requirement would be roughly, it would be one per unit, 2 for a duplex, etc. So, 3 for a triplex, that kind of thing. So I think that would be something that I think would be ultimately, I get the sense that that will be included in the final provisions based on my interpretation of what's going on. It's not finalized, but I get that sense. So yeah, I think I just want to point out though that would not preclude the construction of additional parking units, but it could in effect place increased demand on street parking.
Commissioner Stewart, question?
Yeah, so I'm going back to the balloon versus whittle away approach. I'd be curious to hear what other commissioners think of this, but my question is, what is the RAC's thought process, I guess, behind the whittle away versus the balloon approach? Because the way I see it, on paper, it seems like the balloon approach where you're basing criteria on proximity to services such as urban centers and seems the better approach. And I think as you whittle away, you're going to ultimately get there to that approach as well. So I guess my question is what is the thought process behind this whittle away approach? I don't understand that quite as well.
Yeah, I'll attempt to speak on behalf of the members of that committee. I think that the idea is that it's difficult to predict, for instance, a transit route, where that might be in 5, 10, 15, 20 years in terms of the long-term transit routes change. The city has the ability to direct services to certain areas if they so choose. I think folks are concerned. I think a lot of folks are really concerned about just the dynamic nature of a lot of at least for instance, that transit proximity metric. I think another sort of really big item of conversation has been, again, just getting back at this equity idea. And, I think folks are advocating for flexibility, but there's a number of folks that are also advocating that, essentially, if you're to use this balloon approach, you might sort of produce the types of disparities that they're trying to respond to. So, basically, they're saying that, that might essentially maintain the current ability for, I think this is the argument that would allow jurisdictions to essentially continue to exclude, different types of housing from, the areas where historically it hasn't been allowed, and to allow it in historically, areas where it has been allowed. I think they thought that ran counter to the intent of the bill. So I think that's what their thoughts were on that.
Thank you. Just maybe a comment following on Commissioner Stewart's comments. I would tend to agree with what Commissioner Stewart was saying. To me, it seems like a more logical approach to align to the balloon, try to orient the affordable housing around services and transportation. That seemed more logical. I do agree that, it seems like the whittle away approach would, after you start whittling away, kind of come to the same conclusion, I would think, and have the same areas. But it seemed that my question would be, would it be a correct understanding that maybe the concern was that with the whittle away approach, you're increasing your opportunity to have more affordable housing because you're not just specifically focusing on certain areas, and so it seems like it would have the greater chance to increase where you could have affordable housing and just raise your overall numbers of affordable homes. Is that a correct assessment of maybe some of the rationale for the whittle away approach?
I think I'm not sure that it would actually reduce in less or reduce in more affordable housing this way. I think some folks have stated it and stated their support for the whittle away approach because they thought that it would result in more affordable housing. I don't think that that's the same. I don't know that everybody on the committee has that exact sort of thought. But, again, I just stress that there was a lot of talk about the sort of existing patterns of development and how, those, according to a lot of the folks there, have been sort of exclusionary to certain types of housing or certain types of demographics, whatever it might be, and that they're hoping to, sort of counter those patterns, that they're hoping to bring investment to areas where investment might not have existed previously, and to maybe try to come up with something that is more equitable in its physical distribution, I think, as well, in terms of concentrations of poverty and things like that.
Thank you. Commissioners, any other questions? So Erik, maybe one more process question. As we heard through many channels tonight, the that there was some concern just with the process and the input that we can give back to the committees. Could you summarize maybe what our options are? I think we've heard, at least from myself and Commissioner Stewart, that I think we look at the balloon approach, and that seems more logical. But would it be fair to say that we as Lake Oswego would like to have more time to go through our public process, and as we go through and we get more input before they make a final decision? Is that an option for giving input back to them? That maybe we have some initial thoughts, but we as a community would really like to try to be able to get more input before any final decisions are made, and we maybe caution them to make any judgments before this could be vetted out more in the community.
Yeah, I don't know that the process can change. There's a lot of deadlines in the bill that are just in the bill and that aren't really flexible. So really what we're trying to do here is to monitor it, try to respond as much as possible, and I think certainly time is helpful in order to sort of digest everything, but we don't want to get to a place where we've lost our opportunity to provide comment on this bill either. And there are windows that we can sort of get in and provide comment. So I think that's what we're hoping to explore here is that there is a window that we see in terms of at least this sort of larger conceptual question. And I think I really would encourage us to wait until we know more about the minimum requirements before we make a comment, because that just has so much to do with what this will look like. And I think that there are a lot of things that could make the impact fairly minimal that could happen. And there's for instance, with the minimum lot size, there really aren't that many lots that are double the minimum lot size in a lot of zoning districts. So, I think the extent of the impact is just really up in the air at this point, other than the sort of duplex related provisions, I think.
Okay, thanks, Eric. Commissioners, any further comments, questions?
I have a comment.
Yes. Sorry, I see Commissioner Beckett, and then I'll take from Vice Chair Pape after that. Commissioner Beckett, go ahead.
And my sense is that the neighborhood associations, for instance, where you have a lot of very involved citizens at the neighborhood level, are by and large unaware of what's going on with 2001 and 2003. I would like to see the city do more to inform people as to what this change in rules and regulations will mean to the city, or they can begin to weigh in, for instance, between the whittle down and the bubble approach or balloon approach.
Thank you. Vice Chair Pape, you had a comment or question?
Yeah, regarding the density and the parking issues, is there any sense that the committees are going to go so far in regards to making rules and pushing this through that we're going to see some of our streets be required to go one way?
I did not get that impression whatsoever. No. I don't think they're talking about transportation-related mandated changes at all. Yeah, the state won't get involved with that.
So
But the state wants to do to respond. That's another question, right? In terms of what we want to do to plan and sort of, it wouldn't be at least. I'm not aware of any conversations that would, have that type of forced provision from the state on the city.
Okay.
The minimum requirements that they're talking about, Eric, one parking space per dwelling unit, but not putting a cap on it, just saying this is the minimum that you're required to provide. That's in line with our existing parking code for single-family homes. We require one off-street parking space per single-family home. For a studio apartment, I think we require one parking space per unit. Is that right? And for two-unit apartment or two-bedroom apartments, we require 1.25 parking spaces per apartment. So that's where we would see an impact from this, is if we had a triplex or a fourplex, that under our current code, we would require 1.25 parking spaces per bedroom or per unit with 2 bedrooms. Under this minimum requirement from the state, a builder would only be required to provide 1 parking space per unit in that triplex or quad. It's not to say they couldn't provide more. They may very well do that, especially if the demand is there for that. But this is a kind of area where, you know, we can comment and we can say, hey, look, our existing parking standards are a little bit different than what you're looking at. We'd like to have flexibility to apply our own parking standards. They may accept it, they may not accept it, but that's an area where we could comment.
But that is for on-site parking, correct? Siegel?
Correct.
Right. So if cars are then if there's not enough on-site parking, cars then will be diverted to on-street parking, and that's where I'm concerned. If there is conversation or any sense that we're going to start seeing rules or requirements coming out of redirecting traffic, whether it's one-way traffic or a combination of that and narrowing the lanes, there could be a real big hurt on quite a few of the neighborhoods in Lake Oswego.
Yeah, I don't think that's within the scope of the bill. You know, it certainly hasn't been a you know, an idea that the committees have discussed that I'm aware of.
Okay, yeah, don't record these comments then. Hopefully they don't catch them.
I mean,
well, I mean, I think now you're getting into traffic control laws, and that's not land use. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that conversation about sort of infrastructure constraints and the extent to which, you know, transportation constrained areas with constrained transportation infrastructure could be exempted from middle housing is still yet to be determined. But you know, it seems like they're leaning towards the idea of allowing some type of transportation infrastructure related exemption. It doesn't look like level of service would be that reason, but there might be other things that would warrant a constraint.
Thank you, Bill.
Chair, I wanted to say one thing about process at this point, because the process is a state directed process, and we are one of 50 cities around the state that are subject to the provisions of HB 2001. And we have the ability to comment as a city. We also have, it is a public process, and so any interested individual or organization in Lake Oswego can submit comments to the Rules Advisory Committee or the Model Code Technical Advisory Committee, any of these committees. And we would encourage them to do that. If you know, anyone who sees something in here that they've got an idea or a different way of approaching it that would be better for Lake Oswego, bring it to our attention, bring it to the committee's attention. They can either comment of their own accord, or, you know, the city can provide comments. So far, we haven't seen anything that really, you know, other than these 2 issues with parking and the whittling away versus balloon, that have really, you know, we are tracking that. I think it might be helpful actually to see the draft proposal that comes out in the next week or 2, Eric, that we'll actually see what it is that they're drafting.
The entire draft won't necessarily be there, but I think, you know, it won't be finalized, I guess. So the entire sort of administrative rules, right? But they have these tables where they're kind of, you know, placing the concepts, and that will be developed for all the different middle housing types. So yeah, there will be a lot more detail. It won't be in the form of what would be adopted, but it's getting further.
Yeah, and that's good. We want to see it before it's adopted.
Yes.
And we want, and we've tried to be very transparent about this as well, with posting these monthly updates on the website. There's a project number for this effort. What is it, Eric? Planning project number 20-19-0008 for this one. Yeah, 19-0008. So it's there. It's publicly available. The state's process is public, and that's where we're at.
I know that there's a lot of sort of anxiety about just not knowing what will be there, but you know, we're not able to do too much until we know. And that's kind of what this whole grant application is about, is when are we going to know, and what can we do to get everybody on board to sort of hit the ground running and respond once we know what it is that we're responding to. And it's a frustrating process. It looks like we're doing a lot of work, whereas, we're just trying to sort of document what's going on and understand. So, I think, folks are really wanting to be involved because they see that we've developed all, reports and et cetera, but it's difficult to say how this will impact folks. So it's difficult to even talk to people about, what they could expect without knowing something about the minimum lot size, what that would be, without knowing more about, the areas and even, kind of what could be excluded or whittled away. So, I think a lot of folks' concerns about infrastructure constraints or infrastructure sort of burden, it might be the case that the process allows us to accommodate those concerns, that the minimum requirements allow us the flexibility to think really hard about infrastructure, and we just don't know. It could have less of that, but just the way that it's moving, it does look like it's going to be a fairly flexible process outside of the really like mandated things in the bill itself that are in that language.
Great, thank you, Erik.
It might not make a lot of folks, on the sort of advocacy side happy. So I think that'll be the tension at the rulemaking advisory committees meetings in the coming months.
Thank you. Commissioners, any final comments or questions? Well, Erik, I would just like to say thank you to you and the rest of the staff for giving us the update. I'd also kind of reiterate what I think I heard from staff was that for those who may be following along in Lake Oswego, it's a state-driven process, and so while we have a great community involvement and engagement and dialogue here in Lake Oswego, I would encourage folks that have concerns or questions to make sure that they are kind of going directly to the state. There are, public hearings, opportunities to leave comments. We have state representatives, and we're hearing concerns. And so I'd say, make sure from a state level that organizations and individuals are reaching out to the state representatives and the state committees that are involved to make sure that their voices are heard. And I definitely appreciate what's being done at the local level. I think staff is really trying to help us out and kind of give us good summaries. But in the end, it is a state process. And so sometimes there's power going directly to those who are, driving the process and ultimately enacting the legislation. And so, I'd encourage folks who are following this tonight to, reach out directly to those committees, state representatives, and make sure their voices are heard. Okay, no further questions, so I'd like to move on to the agenda. Any final comments, Erik, or we move on?
I would just mention really quickly that, the DLCD meetings, if people are wanting to provide written comment, they include all of the written comments they receive in their meeting packets. So the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, other committees, they see those, they don't just go into some black box. They are often discussed and included in the packets directly so folks can see them. So that was kind of my, the reason I was saying July 7th might be a good day to get them, because that's when the packet will be distributed. So anyway, just pointing out that, I think they are attempting to get those voices in the conversation. So encourage folks to provide those voices.
Thank you, Erik. So we'll move on to the next.
I have a second question for Erik. And
Okay.
reading through these documents, there are so many abbreviations between DLCC and RMCC and RM this, that, and maybe you could put out a glossary that takes all those acronyms and tells us the name and function of the committee.
Okay. I could do that. I think on that process diagram, the rulemaking structure that I made earlier, that does have some of the acronyms included in that too. But there's more that's included in that sort of diagram.
Yeah,
so I'd be happy to put them together. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot, and I'm trying to simplify it as much as possible. But yeah, it's a lot going on, a lot of committee meetings. But yeah, I do everything I can to compile all those abbreviations for you, Commissioner Beckett.
Right. Thank you. So we'll move on to the next agenda item. This is other business. Item number 7 on the agenda. I didn't have anything. Director Siegel, anything that staff would like to raise under other business? On. All right. So then item number 8 is schedule review. Director Siegel, would you like to give us a schedule update?
Thank you, Chair. Just real briefly, your next meeting is July 13th, and we will have a work session prepared for you, or materials prepared for a work session on the annual Community Development Code amendments for 2020. So it's a working list of amendments that staff compiles based on feedback from applicants, neighborhood associations, and staff as they work through development review. Ellen Davis is the planner on that, so that packet will be coming to you by the end of this week for your meeting on the 13th. The other item that we had tentatively scheduled for the 13th is a work session on the Flood Hazard Overlay Code, and we are still awaiting comments back from DLCD and FEMA. And I think if we have not received their comments by probably by the middle of this week, then that will have to be postponed until the next meeting, it looks like. Unfortunately, it's outside of our span of control. But we'll bring that to you just as soon as we have comments back from the agencies. On the 27th, we have a work session scheduled on the Sustainability and Climate Action Plan. So this is something I know that Chair Heap and leadership from the Sustainability Advisory Board and others have been following very closely. And I don't know, Chair Heap, if you had anything that you wanted to say about preparations that are being made for that work.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me, Director Siegel. I had forgot about that. We did put out a request to the commissioners to see if commissioners were interested in working on a committee to look at electrical vehicle charging in Lake Oswego with respect to implementing the climate action plan. And so I did receive one commissioner's interest. So Commissioner Beckett would like to participate, and thank you, Commissioner Beckett, for volunteering for that committee. The committee is going to work together with the Transportation Advisory Board, the Plan Commission, the Sustainability Advisory Board, and I think members of the Sustainability Network may be involved too. So it's really an opportunity to kind of study the issues. It's not necessarily to, make specific recommendations or look at recommendations for, enacting specific code, but it's really to study the problem and look at what other cities are doing. Look at incentives that may be out there with some of our community key partners like PGE, and really study the problem and get a better understanding of it, and combine the efforts of the relevant boards and commissions that we have. That will work with the Sustainability Advisory Board, who's I think taking the lead at kind of setting up the organization for that. So stay tuned and we'll follow up. And again, thanks to Commissioner Beckett for volunteering for that committee. I plan to also be involved, so we'll have 2 representatives from the Plan Commission.
Yeah, Chair Heap, that's all that I had on the schedule update. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. Thanks for all the input tonight, and thanks for staff for giving us the excellent updates on the housing bills and policies. Thank you. Good evening.
Thank you for going to a different microphone. I can understand you now. At the beginning of the meeting, you were unintelligible to me.
No problem, Commissioner Beckett. We want to make sure everybody can hear and everybody has their voice heard and everyone's able to contribute. So thank you. Yes. Good evening. Meeting's adjourned.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Okay.